On the evening of October 3rd, 22, Jessica Hartman sat at her kitchen table in Naperville, Illinois, scrolling through her husband's Facebook page on her laptop. She wasn't searching for anything in particular. Her husband Brian, a 39-year-old software engineer at a healthcare technology firm, had promised her 6 months earlier that his affair was over. They had been through counseling. They had recommitted to their marriage. Their 2 sons, ages 7 and 10, were upstairs doing homework, unaware that their parents' relationship had nearly collapsed the previous spring. Jessica clicked on Brian's tagged photos out of curiosity, looking at images from a recent company barbecue. She scrolled past colleagues holding paper plates and children playing on bounce houses. Then she stopped. The photo was dated September 14th, 22, just 3 weeks earlier. Brian stood in a dark gray suit beside a woman in a white lace dress. They were cutting a cake. Behind them hung a banner that read, "Just Married." Jessica stared at the screen, her breath caught in her throat. She enlarged the image. The woman beside Brian was Melissa Torres, the same coworker Brian had sworn he'd ended things with back in March. What Jessica didn't know was that Brian Hartman had been living a double life far more complex than a simple affair. For 18 months, he had maintained 2 separate marriages, 2 households, and 2 complete identities, all within a 30-mile radius of downtown Chicago. Both women believed they were his only wife. Both households operated under the assumption that Brian's demanding job required frequent overnight travel and weekend work. And until that Facebook photo was accidentally posted by a guest at his second wedding, neither woman had any reason to suspect the truth. This is the story of how one careless social media post unraveled an elaborate deception, destroyed 2 families, and exposed a man who had convinced himself he could sustain the impossible indefinitely. Brian Hartman was 39 years old and 22. He had worked as a senior software engineer at MedTech Solutions in downtown Chicago since 2016, earning approximately $135,000 annually. Co-workers described him as competent but unremarkable, someone who completed assignments on time and rarely socialized beyond mandatory company events. His job involved developing database systems for hospital management software, work that required occasional travel to client sites and frequent off-hours maintenance windows, which Brian used to explain his absences. Brian had been married to Jessica Hartman since 2012. Jessica, age 37, worked as a middle school art teacher in Naperville, where the couple owned a 3-bedroom split-level home on Fairfield Avenue. Their 2 sons attended the same school where Jessica taught. To friends and neighbors, the Hartmans appeared stable, if somewhat disconnected. Brian's work schedule meant he was often absent from school events and weekend activities. Jessica had grown accustomed to managing the household largely on her own. In early 21, Brian began spending extended periods claiming he was assigned to a major system upgrade project that required him to work from a temporary office in Schaumburg, approximately 25 miles northwest of Naperville. According to statements Jessica later provided to investigators, Brian explained that the project would last 6 to 8 months and would require him to stay at a corporate apartment near the Schaumburg office 3 to 4 nights per week to minimize commute time. Jessica accepted this explanation without suspicion. Brian's company had assigned him to similar short-term projects in the past. What Jessica did not know was that Brian had met Melissa Torres at a professional networking event in January 21. Melissa, age 34, worked as a project coordinator at a medical billing company in Arlington Heights. She was recently divorced with no children and living in a rented townhouse on Kensington Drive. According to digital records later obtained by investigators, Brian and Melissa began communicating regularly within days of meeting. Text message logs showed daily exchanges that quickly became personal and romantic in nature. By March 21, Brian had moved beyond simply messaging Melissa. Bank records later revealed he rented a 1-bedroom apartment in Rolling Meadows, a suburb positioned almost exactly between Naperville and Arlington Heights. The apartment lease was signed under his name and required a $100 monthly payment. Brian told Jessica the apartment was provided by his employer for the duration of the Schaumburg project. He told Melissa the apartment was his permanent residence following what he described as a recent separation from his wife. If you're new here, consider subscribing and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Over the following months, Brian constructed elaborate routines to maintain both relationships. Monday and Tuesday nights, he stayed at the Rolling Meadows apartment alone, using those evenings to manage finances and coordinate schedules. Wednesday and Thursday nights, he stayed with Melissa at her townhouse in Arlington Heights, explaining to Jessica that he was working late at the Schaumburg office. Friday through Sunday, he returned to Naperville and resumed his role as husband and father. When Melissa questioned why she could not visit him at his apartment, Brian claimed he was uncomfortable bringing anyone to the space while his divorce was being finalized. When Jessica asked why she could not visit the corporate apartment, Brian explained that company policy prohibited family members from staying at temporary housing due to insurance liability. The financial burden of maintaining two households began accumulating immediately. Brian's salary, while substantial, could not support the combined expenses. Beyond the $100 monthly rent for the Rolling Meadows apartment, Brian was purchasing duplicate clothing, toiletries, and household supplies. He was paying for dinners, entertainment, and gifts for Melissa while continuing to contribute to mortgage payments and family expenses in Naperville. Credit card statements later reviewed by investigators showed that by late 2021, Brian had accumulated approximately $34,000 in debt across 5 cards issued in his name alone. The relationship between Brian and Melissa intensified throughout 2021. By November, Melissa began expressing interest in marriage. According to testimony she later provided, Brian responded enthusiastically, claiming that his divorce would be finalized by early 2022 and that they could marry soon after. Melissa had no reason to doubt this narrative. Brian had maintained consistent stories about his estranged wife, his separation, and his eagerness to move forward with his life. Meanwhile, in Naperville, Jessica Hartman began noticing changes in her husband's behavior. His work project in Schaumburg, originally scheduled to conclude in September 2021, had been extended repeatedly. By December, Brian claimed the project would continue into 2022. Jessica also observed that Brian seemed distracted when he was home. He spent significant time on his phone, often stepping outside to take calls he described as work-related. When Jessica suggested they plan a family vacation, Brian declined, citing concerns about taking time off during a critical project phase. In February 2022, Jessica discovered text messages on Brian's phone that referenced another woman. The messages were vague but affectionate in tone. When confronted, Brian admitted he had been involved with a coworker named Melissa, but insisted the relationship had been brief and was now over. He claimed it had developed out of loneliness during his extended time away from home, and that he deeply regretted it. Jessica was devastated, but agreed to attempt reconciliation. Brian promised to end all contact with Melissa and committed to attending marriage counseling. They began weekly sessions with a licensed therapist in March 2022. What Jessica did not know was that Brian had no intention of ending his relationship with Melissa. Instead, he adjusted his approach. He told Melissa that his ex-wife was creating complications in the divorce proceedings and that he needed to reduce visible communication temporarily to avoid legal issues. Melissa, trusting Brian's explanations, agreed to limit their text messages and phone calls. They continued seeing each other in person, with Brian maintaining his routine of staying at her townhouse on weeknights under the guise of working late. By summer 2022, Melissa's patience was wearing thin. She wanted formal commitment. She wanted to be introduced to Brian's family and friends. She wanted a wedding. Brian, under pressure and unwilling to lose either relationship, made a decision that would ultimately expose everything. He proposed to Melissa in July 2022. Melissa accepted immediately. They began planning a small wedding ceremony to take place in September. To Jessica, Brian explained that his work project in Schaumburg had been extended again and would now continue through the end of the year. He claimed the company was compensating him with additional pay and had renewed the corporate apartment lease. Jessica, focused on rebuilding trust and managing their household, accepted this explanation, though she remained frustrated by his continued absences. On September 14, 2022, Brian Hartman married Melissa Torres in a small ceremony at a banquet hall in Palatine, Illinois. Approximately 30 guests attended, including Melissa's family members, friends, and several co-workers. Brian claimed his own family could not attend due to ongoing estrangement related to his divorce. The ceremony was officiated by a justice of the peace. Melissa wore a white lace dress purchased from a bridal boutique in Schaumburg. Brian wore a dark gray suit. The couple exchanged vows, signed a marriage certificate, and celebrated with dinner and dancing. Several guests took photographs throughout the evening and posted them to social media. One guest, a former college friend of Melissa's, tagged both Brian and Melissa in a photo showing the couple cutting their wedding cake. The photo included the Just Married banner visible in the background. The post was set to public visibility, making it accessible to anyone connected to either Brian or Melissa on Facebook. Brian did not notice the post immediately. He returned to Naperville the following evening, Friday, September 15th, and resumed his normal weekend routine with Jessica and their sons. He attended his younger son's soccer game on Saturday morning. He helped with yard work on Sunday afternoon. To all appearances, he was a husband working through marital difficulties and attempting to reconnect with his family. 3 weeks passed. On the evening of October 3rd, 22, Jessica Hartman was scrolling through Facebook when she clicked on Brian's profile to look at recent photos. She had been feeling more optimistic about their relationship. Counseling had seemed productive. Brian had been more present during his weekends at home. She was browsing casually, looking at images from a company event, when she encountered the wedding photo. Jessica stared at the image for several minutes, trying to process what she was seeing. She checked the date, September 14th, just 3 weeks earlier. She enlarged the photo and examined every detail. The banner, the cake, the woman in the white dress. She recognized Melissa from photos Brian had shown her months earlier when he had confessed to the affair. Jessica's hands began shaking. She took screenshots of the image and scrolled through the guest's profile to find additional photos from the same event. She found 6 more images, all clearly showing Brian and Melissa at a wedding reception. Jessica called her sister, who lived 20 minutes away. Her sister arrived within 30 minutes. Together, they reviewed the photos. Her sister suggested Jessica confront Brian immediately, but Jessica decided to wait until she had gathered more information. She did not want Brian to have time to construct a believable explanation. The following morning, October 4th, Jessica called Melissa's phone number, which she had saved months earlier during the initial discovery of the affair. Melissa answered. Jessica identified herself as Brian Hartman's wife and stated that she had seen photos from a wedding on Facebook. There was a long silence. Melissa responded that she did not understand what Jessica was talking about. Jessica described the photos in detail. Melissa's confusion turned to alarm. She asked Jessica to clarify when she had married Brian. Jessica stated that they had been married since 2012 and had 2 children together. Melissa ended the call abruptly. Within minutes, she retrieved her own marriage certificate from the filing cabinet in her home office. The document listed her marriage to Brian Michael Hartman, date of birth, March 7, 1983, on September 14, 22. She then opened her laptop and began searching public records. Within 20 minutes, using a basic county records database, she located a marriage record for Brian Michael Hartman and Jessica Ann Porter, dated June 16, 2012, in DuPage County, Illinois. The record had never been dissolved. Melissa called Jessica back. The conversation that followed lasted nearly 2 hours. Both women compared timelines, bank statements, work schedules, and details Brian had provided to each of them. The scope of Brian's deception became clear. He had maintained 2 separate lives, 2 separate narratives, and 2 separate commitments simultaneously for 18 months. His marriage to Melissa was legally invalid because his marriage to Jessica had never been dissolved. Hit the like button if you're still with me, and drop a comment. What would you have done if you discovered something like this? Would you have confronted him immediately or gathered evidence first? Jessica and Melissa agreed to meet in person the following day. They met at a coffee shop in Schaumburg, a location roughly equidistant from both of their homes. During that meeting, they reviewed phone records, credit card statements, and photographs. They discovered that Brian had been using his Rolling Meadows apartment as a storage location for duplicate belongings and as a neutral space where he could manage the logistics of his double life. They also discovered that Brian had taken out personal loans totaling $18,000 to cover escalating expenses, loans that neither woman had been aware of. After the meeting, both women agreed to contact law enforcement. On October 6, 22, Jessica Hartman filed a report with the Naperville Police Department. Melissa Torres filed a separate report with the Arlington Heights Police Department. Both reports alleged fraud and bigamy. Detectives from both jurisdictions coordinated and opened a joint investigation. Investigators immediately requested Brian Hartman's financial records, phone records, and employment records. Bank statements confirmed Brian had been making payments on the Rolling Meadows apartment lease since March 21. Credit card records showed purchases at locations in Naperville, Arlington Heights, and Rolling Meadows, demonstrating a pattern of movement between all 3 areas. Phone records revealed Brian maintained two separate cell phones, one registered under his full name for communications with Jessica, and one registered under his middle name for communications with Melissa. On October 8, 2022, detectives contacted Brian's employer, MedTech Solutions. Human Resources confirmed Brian had never been assigned to a project in Schaumburg requiring temporary housing. The company had no corporate apartments and had never provided temporary accommodations for Brian. His work assignments had remained consistent since 2019. With occasional travel to two client sites, but no extended deployments. Armed with this information, detectives arranged to interview Brian. On October 10, 2022, Brian Hartman was contacted at his workplace and asked to come to the Naperville Police Department for questioning. He arrived voluntarily at 2:00 p.m., accompanied by an attorney. During the interview, Brian admitted to maintaining relationships with both women, but initially denied that his actions constituted bigamy. He claimed he believed his marriage to Jessica had been legally dissolved through an informal separation. When presented with marriage records showing no dissolution had occurred, Brian's attorney requested a recess. The interview resumed 30 minutes later. Brian then acknowledged that he had married Melissa while still legally married to Jessica. He stated he had not intended to harm anyone and had convinced himself that he could eventually resolve the situation by filing for divorce from Jessica and legitimizing his marriage to Melissa. Detectives asked Brian why he had proceeded with a wedding ceremony and signed a marriage certificate knowing he was already married. Brian stated he had been under significant pressure from Melissa and had made a series of poor decisions, driven by his desire to avoid conflict. He claimed he had planned to file for divorce from Jessica in early 2023 but had not yet taken any steps to do so. Investigators obtained a warrant to search the Rolling Meadows apartment. Inside, they found evidence of Brian's divided life: two sets of clothing, duplicate electronics, separate filing systems containing documents related to each household, and a wall calendar marking which days he planned to spend at each location. They also recovered a notebook containing detailed notes about conversations Brian had with each woman, apparently used to keep his stories consistent. On October 18, 2022, the DuPage County State's Attorney's Office filed formal charges against Brian Hartman. He was charged with bigamy, a Class A misdemeanor under Illinois law, and multiple counts of financial fraud related to credit card applications and personal loans obtained under false pretenses. Brian was arrested at his workplace on October 20th and released on $25,000 bond. Following his arrest, Brian moved out of the Naperville home and into a budget extended stay hotel near O'Hare Airport. Jessica filed for divorce immediately. Melissa filed for annulment of her invalid marriage. Both women also filed civil lawsuits against Brian seeking damages for emotional distress and financial losses. The criminal case proceeded to trial in March 23. During the trial, prosecutors presented the evidence systematically. The marriage certificate from 2012 proved Brian's legal marriage to Jessica. The marriage certificate from September 22 proved his attempt to marry Melissa while the first marriage remained valid. Financial records demonstrated the elaborate system Brian had constructed to fund both households. Phone records and text messages showed the extent of his deceptions to both women. Jessica Hartman testified about the 18 months during which Brian claimed to be working on a project in Schaumburg. She described believing his explanations and attempting to support what she thought was a demanding work assignment. She recounted discovering the affair in February 2022, Brian's promises to end it, and the counseling sessions they attended together while Brian was simultaneously planning a wedding with Melissa. Melissa Torres testified about meeting Brian, believing he was separated and awaiting divorce, and planning a future with him. She described the wedding ceremony, the months of living as his wife, and the shock of learning his previous marriage had never ended. She stated that Brian had introduced her to his coworkers as his fiancée, and later his wife, and that she had no reason to suspect he was lying about his marital status. Brian's defense attorney argued that Brian had not acted with criminal intent, but had rather made a series of impulsive decisions, driven by fear of losing both relationships. The attorney emphasized that Brian had not profited financially from the deception and had in fact incurred significant debt. The defense requested leniency, citing Brian's lack of prior criminal history and his expressed remorse. The prosecution countered that Brian's actions were deliberate, calculated, and sustained over 18 months. They pointed to the notebook found in his apartment as evidence of premeditation and careful planning. They argued that Brian's deception had caused substantial emotional and financial harm to both women and had violated the law clearly and intentionally. The jury deliberated for approximately 6 hours. Brian Hartman was found guilty of bigamy and 3 counts of fraud. The fraud convictions related to credit card applications on which Brian had misrepresented his financial obligations and marital status. Sentencing took place in May 23. The judge noted the extensive harm caused to both families, particularly to Jessica and Brian's 2 sons. The judge sentenced Brian to 18 months in county jail on the bigamy charge and concurrent sentences on the fraud charges. He was also ordered to pay restitution, totaling $52,000, divided between Jessica and Melissa, to cover documented financial losses and legal expenses. Brian Hartman served 14 months of his sentence before being released in July 24. His employment with MedTech Solutions was terminated following his arrest. According to public records, he currently works as a freelance software consultant and resides in a rented apartment in Elgin, Illinois. He has supervised visitation rights with his 2 sons, but limited contact. Jessica Hartman's divorce was finalized in November 23. She retained full custody of both children and was awarded the marital home. She continues to teach middle school art in Naperville. In a brief statement provided through her attorney, Jessica said that her sons are receiving counseling to help process the disruption to their family and that she is focused on providing them with stability. Melissa Torres' annulment was granted in December 22. She relocated to Wisconsin in 23 to be closer to family and has declined all media requests for interviews. Through her attorney, she issued a statement saying that she had believed in good faith that her marriage was legitimate and that she hopes to rebuild her life privately. The Facebook photo that exposed Brian's double life was eventually deleted by the guest who posted it, but not before it had been screenshot and shared widely among both families' social circles. The incident became a cautionary tale within their community about the intersections of social media, deception, and the assumption that the lives people present online reflect reality. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more cases like this.